17 years, and this is all you've accomplished. We need speed, not people who slow things down.
Speed won't save someone who doesn't understand what they're destroying. You'll realize that much later than I did.
The words landed before the chair even stopped moving. This isn't working anymore. Dean. He smiled the way people do when they think confidence sounds like leadership. The meeting was scheduled for 15 minutes. It lasted less than 3. No warning, no review, just a decision already made, delivered like a courtesy. He talked about vision, about momentum, about how the company needed a new direction. Then he said the part that stung on purpose. 17 years was a long time, but not necessarily a relevant one. The room stayed quiet. No one disagreed. No one looked at me. For 17 years, I had been the person who made sure things didn't fall apart. When deals stalled, I fixed them. When systems broke, I stayed late and rebuilt them. I wasn't flashy. I didn't chase credit. I kept operations stable while other people rotated through titles and strategies. That was my role. Keep the engine running, clean up the mess, make sure tomorrow still worked. The man across the table had been CEO for less than a year, young, polished, certain that speed mattered more than memory. He believed cutting old parts proved strength. He spoke in clean phrases learned from board decks and consultants. I was an expense to him, a symbol of what he wanted gone. He slid the termination packet across the table without looking up. Security appeared too quickly, like they'd rehearsed it. My access card was taken. I was told to clear my desk immediately. Not later, not today, now. 17 years reduced to a checklist. Anger pressed hard behind my ribs, sharp and humiliating. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind them who kept this place alive when plans failed. But I didn't. I picked up the pen, scanned the page, and signed where they told me to sign. No speech, no fight, no apology, just my name. Steady and precise, sealing a decision they thought only ended something. I felt their certainty settle around me, unaware that my calm wasn't surrender, but the beginning of consequences they never anticipated fully. If this moment hit close to home, take a second and check in with yourself. How are you really feeling right now if you can? Do something small for your body tonight. Step outside for a short walk after the story ends. Let your eyes rest somewhere far and remind yourself the day doesn't own you. Tell me where you're listening from. I always like knowing how far these stories travel. If you want to hear how this decision started unraveling everything, stay with me and consider subscribing it. Helps these stories find the people who need them, because what happened next is where the real consequences began. After the meeting, the building felt unchanged, which somehow made it worse. People still typed, phones still rang, and screens still glowed with work I had designed to survive days like this. My name had been erased in minutes, but my fingerprints were everywhere. I thought about the first crisis, 17 years earlier, when a supplier collapsed overnight and took half our production schedule with it. I slept on the office couch for 3 nights, renegotiated contracts, and rebuilt the workflow before dawn. No memo ever mentioned that. Another year. A regulatory audit nearly shut us down. I rewrote compliance processes line by line and stood beside the old CEO while he promised stability. He trusted me because I delivered without drama. That was always my role. I stayed calm when others panicked. I chose boring solutions that worked instead of flashy ones that failed loudly. I absorbed blame when something went wrong and redirected praise when things succeeded. It wasn't noble. It was practical. The company survived because someone had to carry the weight quietly. The new CEO didn't value any of that. In his town hall the following week, he joked about legacy employees who slowed progress. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. He talked about adaptability, about trimming what no longer fit his vision, and people laughed because laughing was safer than remembering. Hearing it stung more than the firing itself. What bothered me most was realizing how little he actually knew. He hadn't read my full personnel file. He hadn't seen the evaluations, the retention reviews, or the signatures that followed me year after year. To him, I was a line item he could cut to prove decisiveness. Speed mattered. History did not. I sat there understanding that my bitterness wasn't about pride, but erasure. Years of context had been dismissed as inconvenience. Experience was treated like clutter. The company wanted speed, not memory. And he wanted applause, not accountability. I realized then that being underestimated was not an insult, but an opening. People who ignore history repeat mistakes, especially when they believe they are smarter than those who came before them. That thought settled heavily, sharpening my resentment while quietly reshaping it into something colder, more patient, and far more dangerous than anger. I didn't know how right I was. That night, at home, I opened an old folder I hadn't touched in years. It held documents from a program introduced long before his arrival, back when the board worried about losing institutional knowledge, a retention plan, deferred equity, pages everyone signed and then forgot. I read slowly, bitterness tightening my jaw. Buried in plain language was a condition no one mentioned anymore. 17 years hadn't just been loyalty. They were qualification. And termination wasn't only an ending. It was a trigger, waiting patiently for someone careless enough to pull it once the anger faded. Something steadier took its place. I stopped replaying the meeting and started doing what I had always done best, reading systems instead of people. That night, I spread old contracts across my kitchen table, the kind of documents everyone signs once and then forgets. I didn't rush. Paperwork rewards patience. The retention equity plan was older than most executives still in the building. It had been introduced during a period when turnover scared the board more than competition. The logic was simple: reward stability, discourage sudden exits, protect institutional knowledge. On paper, it looked boring. In practice, it was meticulous. My equity had never been visible. It wasn't listed as shares, voting rights, or ownership. It existed as deferred conversion units, frozen until specific conditions were met year after year. Performance reviews reaffirmed eligibility. Each signature quietly extended the timeline. The company kept me. I kept the company running. The balance held. I followed the language carefully, line by line, because words like upon, following, and effective mattered. The key clause wasn't hidden. It was precise. Conversion would occur only after termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise. Not resignation, not retirement. Termination. That single condition unlocked everything. The calm came when I understood what had already happened. The CEO hadn't just removed me from payroll. He had completed the final requirement of a process designed long before his arrival by treating my dismissal as administrative cleanup. He had activated a mechanism he never knew existed. The plan didn't need my consent, approval, or reaction. It needed separation. I leaned back and let that settle. There was no call to make, no document to submit, no dramatic reveal. The system didn't care about outrage or justification. It followed instructions. Conversion wasn't optional. It was automatic, quiet, procedural. For the first time since the meeting, I felt completely in control, not because I was plotting revenge, but because nothing required me to move. Years of structure were unfolding exactly as written. Every step had been rehearsed on paper long before emotion entered the room. The irony was almost elegant. I had been fired for being considered outdated, slow, resistant to change. Yet the mechanism that now favored me existed because I believed in preparation over impulse, while the CEO celebrated speed. The system responded to sequence. He thought action created power. In reality, timing did. I closed the folder and placed it back where it belonged. There was nothing to announce, nothing to demand. The paperwork had already spoken, and once paperwork starts moving, it doesn't ask permission. It proceeds, steadily and without emotion, toward outcomes that surprise only those who never bothered to read what they signed. If you understand the true meaning of this passage, please comment one sentence. Days passed without a sound from me, and that silence felt deliberate, controlled. I returned to routines outside the building, letting distance replace urgency. Knowing systems rarely fail loudly first, but whisper warnings to those trained to notice them early. The first notice reached the board before it reached anyone else. A compliance alert routed, flagged as routine yet unusual. It questioned voting alignment, referenced deferred instruments, and requested confirmation timelines. Nothing, just enough to slow decisions and force attention. By the second week, messages followed, technical in tone, procedural in nature. Certain voting rights were marked temporarily inactive pending review, a safeguard embedded long ago. It didn't stop meetings, but it softened authority, creating hesitation where confidence had lived. The CEO dismissed it, administrative noise. He called it, the kind that appears when organizations grow. He instructed legal to clear it. Confident speed would erase friction, unaware that haste often magnifies systems designed to respond only after decisions settle. I read none of the messages. Silence remained my strategy. Any reaction would have introduced variables, and variables complicate processes. The system was moving on its own schedule now, indifferent to personalities, titles, or the impatience of anyone demanding clarity inside the company. Confusion grew quietly. Managers hesitated before casting votes. Committees postponed approvals. Nothing collapsed outwardly. Yet momentum slowed, like machinery losing oil. People sensed resistance, but blamed bureaucracy, never suspecting design, intention, or the mathematics of deferred control. The board requested clarification from internal counsel. A routine inquiry framed as precaution. Documents were pulled, charts reviewed, histories traced. Still, no one used my name. I remained absent, watching patterns align exactly as contractual logic predicted years earlier, silently. The CEO treated the request confident transparency would settle nerves. He joked about lawyers overthinking spreadsheets. His certainty filled rooms. Even as authority thinned, he couldn't see the distinction between noise and signal, between delay and correction unfolding beneath him. When internal counsel finally suggested a full ownership structure review, the tone shifted. That request wasn't routine. It carried weight. I noted the timing, the phrasing, the pause it created. The process had crossed from background motion into consequence territory. I stayed silent as instructed by nothing but patience. The company hadn't collapsed yet. It was preparing to, and the man responsible still believed the problem was clerical. Unaware the system was only warming up according to long-ignored agreements. Pressure finally broke his composure. The CEO stopped pretending the delays were harmless and started demanding answers with raised voices and closed doors. He summoned legal daily, insisting everything be resolved quickly, cleanly, and quietly. Speed, he believed, would reassert control. He pushed counsel to override safeguards, to sign off on decisions that normally required broader review. Emergency approvals were demanded, processes were shortened, authority was assumed rather than confirmed. Each move was framed as leadership, yet each one crossed lines drawn long before his arrival. My name surfaced repeatedly in meetings I never attended. They spoke about me as a complication, a risk, an obstacle that needed neutralizing. He wanted legal to contain whatever mechanism I had triggered, still convinced intent mattered more than structure. I stayed absent by choice. Presence would have legitimized panic. Tension spread through the executive floor. Votes stalled. Committees questioned mandates. Council began documenting objections in careful language, protecting themselves as much as the company. The CEO interpreted hesitation as resistance and answered it with force. Unaware that force activates protections embedded for moments exactly like this, he issued directives that exceeded his delegated authority. He reassigned responsibilities without board consent. He attempted to bypass review thresholds. Each action felt decisive to him, yet everyone generated another exception, another note, another procedural flag. What he didn't see was accumulation. Governance frameworks are unforgiving that way. Violations don't disappear when ignored. They stack. They narrow discretion with every shortcut. His decision space shrank. Though his confidence grew louder trying to fill the gap, legal pushed back gently at first, then firmly. They warned him about exposure, about escalation, about consequences. He dismissed it as overcaution, reminding them who signed their paychecks. That reminder was recorded. Meanwhile, I did nothing. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. The system required pressure to reveal misuse, and he supplied it generously. My absence allowed the record to speak without interference. By the time the board requested a formal briefing, his authority had already been constrained. Temporary measures became standing limitations. Emergency powers expired unused. Oversight expanded. He fought harder, faster, louder, mistaking motion for progress. Every attempt to seize control tightened the rules around him. Every violation handed leverage elsewhere. He believed resistance came from me. It didn't. It came from documents, timestamps, and clauses activated by his own insistence on being right. The confrontation he wanted never arrived, instead. The room kept shrinking, decision by decision, until even he began to sense that pushing back had only accelerated a process no one could now stop. It was confrontation by paperwork, not voices, and he was unprepared for that kind of fight. The harder he pressed, the clearer the trail became, neat and undeniable. By reacting instead of reading, he authored his own constraints. I waited, knowing escalation favored patience, and patience, this time, was entirely on my side. Control shifted quietly, incrementally, irrevocably, while he mistook every warning sign for temporary noise until consequences arrived fully formed. There was something in the back that no one expected. The emergency board meeting was called without explanation, which already told everyone something had shifted beneath the surface. I wasn't invited, and that absence carried weight. When directors arrive early and speak quietly, it means the conversation has moved beyond personalities and into territory where documents decide outcomes today, now, inside the room. Tension replaced noise. Phones stayed face down. Laptops remained closed. The chair called order, and legal counsel stood instead of sitting. That alone signaled seriousness. This wasn't strategy or optics. It was governance reacting to triggers nobody in that room had expected to fire so cleanly before. They didn't start with names. They started with language. The attorney read slowly, precisely, as if sound itself might distort meaning. Retention equity plan, deferred conversion instruments, conditional activation. No emphasis, no emotion, just clauses, definitions, and dates arranged to describe a mechanism functioning exactly as designed by contract terms. The sentence that changed everything arrived without ceremony. Conversion would occur upon termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise. Rights previously suspended were now active. Nobody said my name. Nobody said ownership. They didn't need to. The implication hung there, heavy and undeniable, filling the room with silence between everyone present. I wasn't there to see his face, but I heard about it later. Confidence drained quickly. He asked questions too fast, interrupting counsel, trying to reassert authority through volume. The more he spoke, the quieter the room became, until even he noticed something fundamental slipping beyond his reach entirely. Now, no one accused him, no one defended me. The meeting stayed procedural, disciplined, cold. That restraint made it worse. Panic thrives in chaos, but fear grows in silence. And this silence stretched, thick and controlled, giving the consequences time to settle into the edges of every decision made after that, when legal concluded. The chair cleared his throat and adjusted the agenda. The next meeting would require additional participants. External review might be necessary. The tone shifted from discussion to logistics. That's when my name appeared, carefully, as an invitation rather than a subject for upcoming session only formally noted. The call ended without resolution. Yet nothing felt unresolved. Control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly, recorded in minutes and memos. While people argue about causes instead of effects, I remained absent. But my absence now shaped the room more than presence ever had before this moment now. I received the invitation later that evening. No explanation attached, no tone implied. Just a time, a subject line, and a list of attendees that confirmed what I already understood. The mechanism had completed its first visible cycle, and the board was adjusting accordingly to new authority boundaries now set. I closed my calendar and waited, not with anticipation, but with acceptance. The meeting hadn't named me, yet it had moved everything into position. Control had shifted, quietly, legally, and irrevocably, and all of it happened without me saying a single word to anyone present in that room at all. I returned to the building without a badge, without an escort, and without the posture of someone asking permission. The room shifted when I entered, not loudly, but noticeably, like air pressure changing. This time, I wasn't there as an employee. I was there because the structure required it. The board sat straighter. Legal watched me carefully. The CEO didn't speak. I acknowledged the chair and took the seat offered. Not at the end, not at the center, but deliberately placed where observers usually sit. That alone unsettled them. I explained nothing emotionally. I spoke in terms they respected: beneficiary interest, conversion rights, and the distinction between management and control. I clarified that I did not hold a title inside the company, but I did hold the benefit of its equity. The difference mattered now. The reaction was contained but visible. A director adjusted his glasses twice. Another stopped taking notes. No one interrupted, because there was nothing to argue against. The paperwork had already settled the question. Ownership didn't need my voice to validate it. They waited for me to claim a role, to request reinstatement, to signal ambition. I did none of that. I told them clearly that I had no interest in returning as an employee, executive, or figurehead. 17 years of execution was enough. That declaration unsettled the CEO more than any accusation could have. He leaned forward, confused, trying to understand where that left him. Power, when it refuses to perform, feels threatening. Silence followed, heavy and unresolved. Then I made the suggestion that changed the temperature of the room. I proposed hiring an external CEO, someone experienced, independent, and accountable to the board. I would remain exactly where I was outside management, inside ownership. The board absorbed that quietly. They asked practical questions. I answered them calmly. This wasn't a takeover, it was stabilization. The CEO said nothing, and in that silence, his position became suddenly, painfully clear. I hadn't come back to reclaim a job. I had come to complete a transition already in motion. Authority had shifted, not to me personally, but to structure. And structure, once respected, doesn't need dominance to be felt. They scheduled the next steps carefully, outlining search criteria and governance boundaries. I listened more than I spoke, which seemed to confuse them further. Quiet power often does. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to stand. The old hierarchy was gone, replaced by something slower, firmer, and harder to challenge. I left without ceremony, knowing the most important decision had already been made, not about leadership, but about control, and who no longer possessed it. It wasn't victory in the dramatic sense, but it felt complete. I had stopped reacting and started directing outcomes indirectly. They would adjust, adapt, and justify later, for now. The shift was quiet, undeniable, and irreversible, carried forward by rules everyone had agreed to long before emotions entered the room together calmly. The investigation moved faster than I expected, not because anyone was eager for justice, but because documentation leaves little room for debate. Once governance flags are raised, the process becomes automatic. Intent no longer matters. Records do. The former CEO was formally notified of a review into procedural violations. It wasn't framed as punishment, only verification. Emails were requested, approvals were traced, decisions were mapped against authority limits. Every shortcut he had taken during his push for control reappeared, neatly cataloged. At the center of it all sat one document he barely remembered signing. My termination notice. It wasn't emotional evidence, it was procedural. It showed how he bypassed review requirements, ignored retention conditions, and acted unilaterally where shared authority was required. What he considered efficiency, read. On paper. Like overreach. He defended himself aggressively at first. He spoke about leadership, urgency, and the need to act decisively. The board listened without interruption, which should have worried him. When directors stop engaging, it usually means they're finished evaluating arguments and have moved on to conclusions. Legal counsel laid out the findings calmly. Multiple breaches, compounded violations, a pattern, not an exception. The termination decision wasn't isolated. It was the clearest example of how he misunderstood the limits of his role. That misunderstanding now defined his record. The vote was scheduled without drama. No speeches, no moralizing. Just a simple question of compliance. Each director cast their decision carefully. Some avoiding eye contact, others staring straight ahead. I watched from a distance, not emotionally invested, only attentive to sequence. When the count was complete, the outcome was decisive. He was removed for cause. The language mirrored the process he had used on me. Immediate effect, access revoked, authority terminated, no appeal window, no transition period. The irony didn't escape anyone. His final mistake wasn't arrogance or speed. It was assuming that rules existed to be interpreted by whoever held the title. In reality, titles are temporary. Procedures are not. Security escorted him out the same hallway I had walked weeks earlier. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. The symmetry was enough. The system doesn't seek revenge. It restores balance and moves forward. What struck me most was how quiet it all was. No raised voices, no satisfaction, just resolution. The company didn't celebrate. It recalibrated. That's what organizations do when structure reasserts itself after disruption. Later, someone asked how it felt to see him dismissed using his own process. I didn't answer right away. Feelings weren't relevant anymore. What mattered was clarity. His decision to fire me had triggered every consequence that followed. He thought he was cutting risk. Instead, he documented it. And when the board followed the trail, they did exactly what governance requires. They removed the person who had proven, step by step, that he could not operate within the system he tried to command. Stability returned slowly, the way it always does after turbulence. Not with announcements, but with fewer emergency emails and calmer voices in meetings. Projects resumed. Approvals moved forward. People stopped whispering in hallways and started planning again. Order didn't arrive dramatically. It settled in, practical and reassuring. The board appointed an interim CEO first, then confirmed a permanent one after a deliberate search. She was experienced, unshowy, and careful with language. No speeches about reinvention, no symbolic purges. Her first act was listening, which felt like a correction all by itself. The company didn't need saving anymore. It needed consistency. I stayed out of sight. My role was now structural, not operational. Through the converted equity, I held controlling interest, but nothing about my days changed outwardly. I didn't attend staff meetings. I didn't issue directives. Control, when exercised properly, doesn't announce itself. It waits and intervenes only when necessary. The systems I had built over 17 years finally ran without resistance. Processes aligned. Decisions followed authority. For the first time in a long while. I wasn't fixing problems caused by ego or haste. I watched from a distance, feeling something unfamiliar loosen in my chest. Relief, not triumph. Only the board understood the full sequence of events to everyone else. The transition looked clean, even fortunate. A struggling CEO replaced, governance strengthened, momentum restored. No one needed a villain, no one needed a hero. That anonymity felt like payment, not loss. Occasionally, someone would mention my name in passing, usually in reference to old projects or institutional memory. They didn't know the rest, and I preferred it that way. Visibility invites distortion. Quiet ownership preserves clarity. What mattered was balance. 17 years of contribution hadn't been erased. They had been accounted for. The system had done what systems are meant to do when written well. It corrected excess and rewarded patience without spectacle. I didn't feel victorious walking past the building anymore. I felt complete. The anger that once sharpened every thought had dissolved into something steadier. Justice, I learned, doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like continuity, by choosing to remain behind the scenes. I kept the story from becoming personal. The company moved forward unburdened by grudges, and I moved on, knowing that what I gave had been returned. Not loudly, but fully. In structure, in recognition, and in peace. That quiet resolution was enough for me. I didn't need apologies, praise, or public acknowledgement to validate what had happened. The outcomes spoke clearly through stability and order restored. Work continued, people adapted, and I carried forward, knowing the long arc of patience had finally reached its conclusion, leaving nothing unresolved, nothing owed, and nothing left to prove to anyone. It allowed me to breathe easier, trust the framework, and step fully into the life beyond constant vigilance without resentment, urgency, or fear behind me. Time has a way of quieting things that once felt unbearable. When I look back on those 17 years now, I don't see a straight line of loyalty or sacrifice. I see a series of choices, made calmly, that shaped outcomes long after the moments passed. I stayed because the work mattered. I stayed because stability is built by people willing to carry responsibility without applause, over time. That choice hardened into discipline. I learned how systems behave under pressure, how rules protect organizations when personalities fail, and how patience outlasts authority fueled by ego. Being fired didn't end my career. It ended my participation in someone else's narrative. The separation felt brutal in the moment, but distance clarified everything. What I had built didn't disappear when my title did. It shifted. Control moved from visibility to structure, from daily decisions to lasting leverage. Justice, I've learned, doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't demand raised voices or public reckoning. Real justice is procedural. It arrives quietly, documented, enforceable, and indifferent to emotion when it works. It restores balance without announcing itself. I never needed revenge. I needed alignment. The system delivered that with precision. The same process that dismissed me revealed who truly respected boundaries and who treated rules as optional. In the end, The company corrected itself, not because of anger, but because design allowed it to. There was a moment when I expected to feel satisfaction watching consequences unfold. Instead, I felt something softer. Relief. Closure. The tension that had lived in my chest for years finally released. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even proud. I was simply finished. I didn't hate the man who fired me. Hatred requires attachment, and I had moved past that. He played his role. I played mine. The difference was preparation. When the system responded, it responded to foresight, not force. 17 years were not wasted. They were invested. Every decision, every compromise, every quiet fix had accumulated value that only became visible at the end. Losing a job didn't strip me of purpose. It clarified it. Power. I learned. Doesn't always look like command. Sometimes it looks like patience rewarded. And justice, the quiet kind, doesn't shout when it arrives. It settles, leaves order behind, and allows you to smile without bitterness, knowing nothing more needs to be said. That understanding followed me forward, steady and complete, a reminder that endings can be entrances, and dignity often survives where noise fails. I carry that lesson lightly now, confident that silence can hold strength, and that justice, once done, asks nothing further from you. Nothing else remained unresolved, and I welcomed the future with calm certainty and a quiet smile, alone. I learned that real power doesn't come from reacting fast, but from preparing quietly and letting time do its work. Losing a position doesn't erase your value if what you built is solid and honest. Sometimes, staying calm is the strongest response you have. How did this story make you feel, and which moment stayed with you the most? Tell me where you're listening from. If this story resonated, I'd love for you to comment, like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so we can keep these conversations going together.